This is the story of the man Billboard Magazine called the single most electrifying voice in Christian music. 6 Grammy Awards, 16 Dove Awards, 3 separate inductions into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame, and a secret so heavy it nearly destroyed him. Russ Taff spent decades on stages before thousands of people, singing about grace and freedom and a God who delivers the captive, all while privately fighting a battle he could not tell anyone about. The same industry that celebrated him, that pressed trophies into his hands and booked him on Christian television, left no room for what was actually happening inside. And so he hid the same way his father had hidden before him, in the same shame, using the same method to survive it. Where Russ Taff came from, what it cost him, and what he finally said out loud, that is what this video covers, and it covers the part that gospel music spent a long time avoiding. If the Gaither vocal band is woven into your faith, if the Imperials take you back to something real, if Russ Taff's voice has sat in the back of your memory for 30 or 40 years, what you are about to hear is going to land differently than you expect. This is not a story about falling. It is a story about what grace actually looks like when you run out of everything else, and about one man who finally decided to say so out loud. November 11th, 1953. Farmersville, California, in the San Joaquin Valley. That is where Russell Taff entered the world as the fourth of 5 sons born to Joe and Ann Taff, and from the very beginning, 2 forces shaped everything around him: music and God, both of them enormous, both of them tangled up in complications no child should have to carry. Joe Taff was a Pentecostal preacher whose congregation, East Side Tabernacle Church, gathered in an old laundromat, about 20 people total. A fire-breathing man of genuine faith who loved Jesus with everything he had. But the God Joe Taff preached was demanding and impossible to please, a theology built on perfection and condemnation, on always falling short, and Joe Taff himself could not live up to it. Here is the piece that changes everything. Joe Taff was also an alcoholic. Ann Taff worked the fields, picking fruit, chopping cotton, and she also carried a gift for singing and kept a collection of gospel records in the house that became young Russ's entire musical world. No secular music was permitted, no newspapers, no magazines, no television, just gospel records and the voices that came off them. Mahalia Jackson, the 5 Blind Boys of Alabama, the Blackwood Brothers, and the Statesman Quartet. Especially Jake Hess, a singer Russ came to love the way other kids loved the Beatles or Elvis. He practiced Jake Hess's stage moves in front of his bedroom mirror because those gospel men were the only stars his world allowed. Ann Taff stood her son on the church altar to sing his first solo when Russ was 4 years old, and something stopped the room. And by 11 he was playing guitar, and by every account gospel music was not something Russ Taff chose. That voice chose him. Growing up inside that home, though, was not the stable picture it may have looked like from outside. Russ was 7 years old when he walked in and found his father drunk for the first time, and he has returned to that moment in interviews across many years because it marked something. "I was 7 years old when I found my father drunk," he has said. "I'd never seen drunk before." That same year, the family was removed from their church because of Joe Taff's drinking, and that would not be the last time. Over the years, Joe Taff's alcoholism got the family asked to leave multiple congregations, and the people who were supposed to be their community kept walking away. The worst of it came when Russ was 13, the year the congregation voted his father out as pastor, and then his own uncle tracked Russ down to deliver a message. "Russ, you're not welcome here because you're his son." A 13-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong, whose father had a disease, and the church's answer was to send the son away alongside the father. Russ has put it plainly. "I was 13 years old when we were asked to leave the church, and these were the only people that I knew, and they walked away from us." Inside the family, Russ took on the role that often falls to the most sensitive child, the peacemaker, the one who stays when everyone else checks out. His brothers found ways to emotionally exit the situation, but Russ absorbed it and tried to hold things together, and his mother, weighed down by her own pain, leaned on him in ways no child should carry, using him as a kind of lever in the conflict between herself and her husband, which made Joe Taff jealous of the closeness between his wife and his son. That boy, carrying unprocessed rejection, shame, and grief that nobody around him had any language for, was the same boy whose voice stopped rooms. The church offered no tools for what he was feeling. His family had none either, and the God being preached from his father's pulpit was not a God of comfort, that God demanded more than any human being could deliver. That seed, planted in a laundromat church in California, would keep growing in the dark for a very long time. Around age 15, the Taff family relocated to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and it was there that Russ finally found solid musical ground. When the family eventually moved back to California, Russ stayed behind, and at 16 he co-founded a band called Sounds of Joy with a musician named James Holohan Jr., a partnership that would outlast nearly everything else in his life. Sounds of Joy landed an opening slot for a group that changed the direction of Russ Taff's entire future. The Imperials, one of the most important acts in mid-70s gospel music. A Southern gospel group that was beginning to cross into what the world would eventually call contemporary Christian music. That opening slot put Russ Taff's voice in front of the right people, and that led directly to the audition of his life. 2 weeks before his 23rd birthday in 1976, Russ traveled to Nashville, walked in, and sang. His own account of what happened leaves almost nothing out. I sang with them that afternoon, and that evening they hired me. Same year, he married Tori, the woman who would remain beside him through the highest moments and the lowest ones, the trophies, the stages, the darkness, and the long climb back. What followed from 1976 to 1981 was the kind of run that gospel music fans of a certain generation still talk about with real affection. With Russ Taff driving the vocals, the Imperials became the single best-selling contemporary Christian music group in the country, pulling in 3 Grammy Awards together and 5 Dove Awards, and in 1977, at just 24 years old, Russ won his first Grammy for Best Gospel Performance for the album Sail On. "I was 24 when I won my first Grammy," he has said, with something in his voice that still carries the weight of disbelief. Underneath that success, something was wrong. Russ Taff was the engine powering the Imperials to the top of the CCM world, and the financial arrangement he worked under reflected none of that reality. A flat salary, no share of ticket revenue, no share of album revenue, the same fixed wage no matter how many arenas that voice filled or how many records it moved. Music historians who documented the era confirmed this arrangement, and it was one of the central reasons Russ departed in 1981 to start building a solo career. That solo career became its own story. Walls of Glass earned a Grammy in 1983. Medals, released in 1985, was the best-selling album by any male artist in the entire CCM genre that year. The self-titled Russ Taff record in 1987 took home 2 Dove Awards, including Rock Album of the Year. Under Their Influence added another Grammy in 1991, and work on the Apostle soundtrack brought one more in 1998, for a total of 6 Grammy Awards and 16 Dove Awards across a career that drew from rock, pop, blues, Southern gospel, black gospel, country, and big band, he refusing to be filed neatly in any single category. 3 separate Gospel Music Hall of Fame inductions followed, 1 as a member of the Imperials, 1 as a member of the Gaither vocal band, 1 as a solo artist, and no one in the history of that Hall of Fame has ever been inducted 3 separate times. Nobody. And somewhere right in the middle of all of it, during one of those years of trophies and stages, Russ Taff reached into a refrigerator in a New York City apartment on a hot July afternoon, pulled out a Heineken, and took his very first drink of alcohol. He was 26 years old when he did it. Tori was out shopping, and everything he had been running from his entire life went quiet. Before going further into what happened next, one thing needs to be understood clearly, because this kind of story is easy to misread. Russ Taff has never described his drinking as rebellion, or as a desire to escape his faith, or as something he even wanted to do. The way he tells it, that first drink was not about pleasure or recklessness. It was relief from something that had been tormenting him since he was a child. His father's theology of condemnation, a God who demanded perfection and punished failure, had installed a set of internal voices that ran constantly, and those voices were present on every stage Russ Taff ever stood on. They were there through every Grammy speech, every Gaither concert, every performance where thousands of people in the crowd felt something real and electric coming off that voice. Russ heard the crowd, and then he heard the voices telling him he had no right to be up there. And then, at 5 or 6 or 7 minutes after that Heineken on a July afternoon in New York City, the voices went quiet, and he has described exactly what that felt like. I hated the taste of it, but I finished it. Within 5, 6, 7 minutes, those voices got quieter. That right there is the whole story. The most electrifying voice in Christian music had spent his entire adult life carrying condemning voices so loud and so constant that a beer he did not even enjoy was worth finishing because for a few minutes it gave him peace, and the gospel he had been singing about his whole life, the gospel of grace, of freedom, of whom the Son sets free is free indeed, had never been allowed to reach the place where those voices lived. The church that formed him had never offered him a God who was safe enough to confess to. The years that followed brought self-hatred and self-loathing, his own description, and he continued standing on stages and singing about freedom while feeling like, in his own words, the biggest hypocrite in the world. Periods of sobriety came and went. A stretch from 1988 through 1997 held. But the addiction kept finding him again, and 3 separate rehab stays came and went without the sobriety sticking. All of it happening while the Dove Awards kept coming, while the Gaither homecoming tapings kept rolling, while millions of gospel fans sat in front of their televisions and felt something genuine watching Russ Taff sing. Tori, living through it from inside the marriage, has spoken honestly about what those years cost her. Her words about that period were direct. He was dark, sad, and angry. What I didn't know at the time was that he was exacerbating the depression by pouring a depressant into his system on a regular basis. She did not recognize it immediately as alcoholism because it did not look like the dramatic, stumbling drunkenness of old films. It was quieter than that. Darker, more internal, more invisible. Russ also carried a clinical depression diagnosis, a real biological condition that the alcohol he used to self-medicate was actively making worse, and the combination meant he was in a spiral that no amount of willpower or private prayer could pull him out of on its own. The structures around him, the ministry world, the industry, the CCM ecosystem, had no framework for an artist to stand up and say, "I am currently not okay and I cannot stop." That kind of story did not get you booked at Christian conferences. Yet that kind of honesty had no place in the world that was celebrating him. And so, Russ Taff did exactly what he had watched his father do, unconsciously, by example. He hid. He has said it himself with the kind of clarity that only comes from having survived something. The guilt that I was just like my dad became crippling. Before I knew it, I began hiding, as I had watched my dad do. Around 1997, his father died, and the sobriety Russ had maintained since 1988 broke. 3 rehab stints followed, and each time the sobriety did not hold, because the underlying wounds, the childhood trauma, the shame, the theology of condemnation that had been wired into him before he was old enough to question it. None of that responds to conventional treatment alone. Those wounds required something deeper than drying out. Tori eventually located a residential trauma treatment center, and that is where things finally changed. Somewhere between 63 and 65 days at that facility, at a cost to their family of most of their savings, Russ Taff began to actually get well, not just sober, but well for the first time. When he walked out, the rage toward his father was gone, replaced by something that surprised him. "When I left there, I had this feeling like I wish they were still alive," he said. "I feel sympathy. I think I can talk to them now." The trauma work, the genuine confrontation with his past, is what finally made the sobriety hold. As of February 2025, Russ Taff had been 18 years sober. The question, sitting at the center of everything, is one Russ Taff has been willing to ask out loud even when it makes people uncomfortable. Why did this have to be a secret for so long? "We Will Stand," the anthem that topped Christian radio charts for 15 straight weeks, the song that Shirley Caesar recorded, that Milton Brunson and the Thompson Community Singers recorded, that the Mighty Clouds of Joy recorded, the song about the body of Christ being one regardless of background. The man who sang it could not find within that same body of Christ a safe place to say that he was drowning. That is not a minor irony. That is the heart of the whole thing. Russ has offered a clear answer about why, and he has offered it consistently across years of interviews. The problem was religiosity, which he distinguishes sharply from living faith. Institutional religion that demands performance and punishes vulnerability, that builds its public face around victory testimonies and polished images of spiritual success. That version of Christianity had no room for a broken man, and what it produced was silence and shame. His words on the subject are unambiguous. "I hate religiosity. I just hate it because it robs people of a spiritual experience." That is not a throwaway line from a bitter man. That is the conclusion of someone who has looked back at the full arc of his life and identified what nearly killed him. A Christianity so focused on projecting spiritual triumph that it had no mechanism for wounded people to find healing. His father preached that impossible God. He and the CCM industry reinforced it by requiring Russ to always present as someone already blessed, already healed, already on the other side of whatever he had gone through. The industry celebrated him. What it never offered was a safe place to fall. The backstory of "We Will Stand" makes the irony even harder to look away from. That song grew out of a real incident. Gospel singer Archie Dennis had been booked to perform at a church and arrived to find himself turned away because the congregation had not realized he was black. Out of that rejection, a song was born declaring that the church should be bigger than its divisions, that no one should be cast out. It held the #1 spot on Christian radio for 15 weeks. And Russ Taff, the voice behind it, could not find inside that same church the courage to say out loud, "I'm struggling. Please don't cast me out the way they cast out my father." There is one more piece to this. Russ attends Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and he has spoken in public about what that experience is like compared to his experience inside church settings. In those AA rooms, strangers, no shared background, nothing in common except the struggle, he feels understood and unjudged. He said it plainly. "Well, most of my audience knows I go to AA." And he has said that if the body of Christ were actually doing what it is called to do, those rooms might not need to exist in the way they do, because If the body of Christ was doing what we're called to do, we wouldn't need counselors because we would love each other in a way that brings healing. Gospel music produced something genuinely beautiful through Russ Taff's career, but it also built the conditions in which a wounded man felt he had to keep those wounds invisible. And when this video uses the phrase, "what gospel music didn't want you to know," the point is not a tabloid scandal. The point is a structural silence, a theology of performance over confession, an industry built on the finished story, the completed testimony, the victory past tense, with no space for the person who has not yet found their way through. Russ Taff found his way through. The cost was higher than it needed to be. October 30th, 2018, Russ Taff. I Still Believe opened in over 700 theaters across the country through Fathom Events, and for the people who sat in those screenings, it was something close to a confession made public after decades of waiting. Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, Bart Millard of Mercy Me, Michael Tate of the Newsboys, Jonda Pierce, Mark Lowry, and Bill Gaither all sat for interviews, and so did Tori Taff, speaking honestly about what it cost her to love Russ through those years, and about her own healing through Al-Anon, a thread of the story that deserves its own acknowledgement. The film, currently available on Amazon Prime Video, earned an 8.5 out of 10 on IMDb, and at the end of theater screenings, Russ performed live alongside Stephen Curtis Chapman. Childhood abuse, alcoholism, clinical depression, and the moments Russ had most needed to hide, including arriving drunk to a major Christian television taping, none of it was softened or packaged. This was not a polished redemption reel with a neat bow tied around it. His statement from the documentary trailer carries everything he had arrived at after a lifetime. Prison doors were meant to be open. Captives can be set free. I learned the gospel is greater than I could have possibly imagined. I am a child of the King.